I'm standing here today at the Bush Holley House in Coscob, Connecticut, and I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to speak with Susan Larkin, curator and art historian. I'm very interested to know, what was it about this area of Connecticut in particular, this area in Greenwich, that was such a magnet for these artists and sustained their creativity for so many years?
Well, there were different things depending which part of Greenwich, because artists had been coming to Greenwich for some years. They'd gone out and boarded, took rooms with farmers, and they would paint the wheat fields, and they would paint the cattle and so forth. But when they came to Coscob, they were looking for something very different. They weren't escaping to nature. They were not in a farming community, but it was a small, densely built little port village. Here we are in the Bush Holley House, which was a boarding house at that time, so they had inexpensive accommodations. And what they loved in this house in particular, and in the village of Coscob in general, was the continuity of tradition, the living history that they found here. They weren't just old houses, old warehouses, an old mill, but places from the past that were still in active use. And they loved that. So when they came to Coscob, they came for something different than the ones who went out and boarded with farmers in the backcountry. Here they were attracted by the vernacular architecture, both this house most of all, but other houses in the area, the warehouses that stood across the street, just under where I-95 passes today. They were also attracted by the people of Coscob, and they painted them. Child Hassam in particular painted inside this house. And in this room, which was the best bedroom during the art colony era, Hassam did several paintings, and we have here in the room one beautiful little oil sketch. It's actually on a cigar box lid, of a woman, probably his wife, standing in front of this very fireplace. He did several sketches of a woman, sometimes his wife, sometimes the teenager who lived in the neighborhood, in front of this beautiful federal fireplace. Hassam was unusual among the art colonists in that he did interior figure paintings. Most of them did not. Most of them were interested in the landscape. Elmer McCrae was an exception. Elmer McCrae did figure paintings of his wife and his twins. He also did wonderful pastel portraits on commission for people in Greenwich, but most of them were interested in the outdoors. Another thing that brought artists here and kept the art colony here constantly self-renewing was the summer school that John Henry Twachtman taught here for years and years. He's sometimes with the assistance of his close friend J. Alden Weir, who had his own place up in Branchville near Ridgefield, Connecticut. But that always brought in fresh new blood, young artists who came here to get away from the academic studies at the Art Students League in New York and to paint in open air with a teacher whom they greatly revered, John Twachtman. Twachtman always urged them to try something new, not to just do the same old thing. He said, you must be original, you must get your own voice. So the art colonists here, including the young ones, were looking for, trying new ways, always exploring and experimenting.
It's very exciting. I had read actually that in his class at the Art Students League, Twachtman was very didactic, and they really drew from casts, and it was a very academic program. And here the artists and the students would experience something very different. There was a certain amount of freedom that comes with the summer and comes with being outside an urban center.
Actually, it wasn't just the summer, and that's another thing that set the Coscob Art Colony off from some other art colonies, which were farther removed from New York City, where most of the artists were based in the winter. They were based there because that's where the teaching opportunities were, where the exhibiting opportunities were. So New York City was, you know, as it remains, still an important art center. So the adult artists lived there, and the students, of course, lived there during the academic year to go to school. But Coscob being so close to New York, they could hop on the train and come out for a weekend or a week. John Twachtman, for example, in a letter to Josephine Holley, the landlady of what was then the Holley House, or actually it was called the Old House, capital T, capital O, capital H. He wrote to her during a stay in New York City, staying at the Players Club. And he said, oh, in the morning I wake up, and instead of standing on the upper porch and walking out to see what the day is like, I look down an air shaft. And then I go out into the street among all these bustling people. and he greatly longed for the relative quiet of Cas Cab. But on the other hand, Cas Cab was, as I said, very densely built, and it was also far more ethnically diverse than other parts of Greenwich. So it was similar to New York in its ethnic diversity.
Did those businesses sort of spring up to service the art colony that was thriving here, or were they in place before?
Some were in place before, but I think some were responses to the opportunities that the art colony represented. And also, people in the neighborhood would rent out their rooms. And a lot of visitors to the Bush Holley house say, well, there are not that many bedrooms. Where did the people stay? First of all, they squeezed in beds wherever they could. As we see here, this is a beautiful room that for a long time the Historical Society furnished as a dining room. But our old photographs and so forth show that it was used as a bedroom. There were beds all over the place, so there could accommodate more than we would today with our greater emphasis on privacy. But in addition, there are houses all over the village rented out rooms. Sometimes the artists would just room there and board or have their meals at the Holley house, or sometimes they would do the whole thing, room and board with the local families. So they did represent an economic opportunity.
I'm curious to know a little bit about the colony in Old Lyme and how it maybe differentiated itself from Cas Cab and or had a dialogue with the Cas Cab artists.
Well, there was an interesting point of similarity between the two, which is the central importance of a boarding house and a landlady in each case. In the Florence Griswold house, by definition, it was Miss Florence Griswold, who was the last surviving member of an old New England family. And she, as was the case with Josephine Holley, supported herself in a way that was available to ladies who, there were very limited opportunities for a woman to earn money in those years. And doing for paying guests what you did for your own family, in other words, running a boarding house, was one of the openings.
It's like an extension of your domestic
role.
Exactly. Just for a wider audience.
Exactly, for a wider audience. So they had that point of similarity. And there was a little bit of overlap in membership. Childe Hassam, who was peripatetic throughout his career, he only in 1918, late in his life, did he get a house, a country place of his own. Instead, he traveled widely. He went to the Isles of Shoals. He went to different places in New England. He also went to Old Lyme and did some beautiful paintings there. He painted door panels in the dining room as well. Matilda Brown was a Greenwich artist. She lived in Greenwich, was one of the founders of the Greenwich Society of Artists, and she also went to Old Lyme a few times. I think for Matilda Brown, the attraction of Old Lyme, where she was the only woman artist of any note, I think the attraction there was that they still had a tradition of the holdover of the Barbizon, American Barbizon era, of painting, depicting cattle, and that was one of her specialties as an artist. So she could do that there. She did other things as well. She did beautiful garden paintings, but she could find she certainly couldn't paint sheep and cattle here in Cas Cab, though she did elsewhere in Greenwich. Clark Voorhees was another Greenwich artist. He was from a Greenwich family and had begun his studies under Leonard Ochtman in Cas Cab, but he went up to Old Lyme and spent most of his career there. Ochtman's students, Charles and Mary Roberts Ebert, also spent a long time living at the Holley house. They then had their own home, which still stands. It's a beautiful house in Greenwich where they lived for 20-some years. And then they moved on. They went up to Old Lyme sometimes during the summer, but they are best known in their later years for their paintings of Monhegan Island off Maine. I think what the Lyme artists did with their summer exhibitions was important not just as inspiration for the Greenwich Society of Artists, but nationally. I mean, that was an era when artists were trying to kind of break the monopoly of New York as the art center. They were trying to find alternate exhibition opportunities, and the Old Lyme artists did a superb job of that. They did something different also in Old Lyme. They had a little more property than the Holleys had here. in that they converted some of the old farm buildings and farm sheds out back of what we now call Florence Griswold House into studios for the artists. Originally, that landscape was just considered mainly a background for the history paintings, but they had to go out to the countryside, and they were basically self-taught. So they would gather together. Barbizon was one of the famous earlier ones, and they, as in the case of Barbizon, they could cluster around a well-regarded older artist, in that case Jean-Francois Millet. So they originated in Europe perhaps, though the Hudson River School would go off by ones and twos or small groups to paint in the countryside as well, in the Catskills.
But this idea of a larger colony,
I think,
and to have that kind of camaraderie,
exactly,
and that kind of...
That's, I think, more identified with the American Impressionist. And you have examples of them. Certainly Connecticut has two fabulous ones, in Coscob and Old Lyme. The painters in Pennsylvania around New Hope area, including Robert Spencer, they were a little bit later, but they also gathered in a scenic place that had subject matter that they wanted to paint. So the Greenwich Society of Artists decided, well, okay, they were going to start having exhibitions. Why not? They thought about other places too. It wasn't a foregone conclusion, but they had their first exhibition at the Bruce Museum, and that was the first exhibition ever held at the Bruce Museum.